1,000 days have passed since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In the morning of February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin announced what he called a special military operation, a term the Kremlin still uses to describe the war it unleashed against Ukraine. Hi, you're watching Mediazona's YouTube channel. My name is Miko Golubovsky, and today I'll walk you through the numbers of this horrific conflict.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Immediately after Putin's speech, Russia launched a massive strike on Ukrainian regions, and the military began an offensive in several directions simultaneously. A few days before the invasion, Putin had recognized two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as independent states. Although, at the time, separatists controlled a smaller part of the actual Ukrainian Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But Russian forces didn't stop there. They invaded multiple Ukrainian regions: Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, Sumy, Chernihiv, Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. While many Ukrainian cities fell under Russian control at first, Ukraine's military later succeeded in liberating many of them. The Kremlin claimed this special military operation would denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. From day one, this also meant shellings of residential buildings and killing civilians. In areas they occupied, Russian forces unleashed real terror. They kidnapped, raped, and murdered people. They looted homes and set up filtration camps and torture chambers. Many Ukrainian towns and villages were razed to the ground in the fighting. The Bucha massacre, airstrikes on both a hospital and theater in Mariupol, attacks on Kramatorsk railway station and the shopping mall in Kremenchuk, these are just some of the Russian army's worst atrocities. Since the invasion began, Ukrainian prosecutors have opened nearly 150,000 cases related to war crimes. According to the United Nations, 12,000 civilians have died in Ukraine since the invasion began. This is from their November 2024 assessment. Another 26,000 people have been wounded. The UN monitoring mission notes that civilian casualties have been rising since July 2024. These figures don't tell the whole story. They only account for the cases that human rights defenders could verify. We still don't know how many people died during intense fighting in many parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, which Russia now occupies. Ukraine's Prosecutor General reports that as of November 12th, 589 children have died from Russian attacks. Nearly 2,700 more were injured. Russia now occupies almost 18% of Ukraine's territory, according to late October OSINT analysis by WarMapper. This includes Crimea, which Russia took in 2014, and the self-proclaimed republics in Luhansk and Donetsk. But most of these territories were seized after the 2022 invasion, when Russia gained control over most of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, along with large parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia. Ukraine has managed to liberate significant territory. Early in the war, Ukrainian forces pushed Russia out of the Kyiv and Chernihiv regions. Later, they recaptured Kherson, the only regional capital Russia had managed to seize since February 2022. According to Ukraine's ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets, 14,000 Ukrainian civilians are being held captive. This number, reported last summer, includes people captured by Russian forces in annexed Crimea and the People's Republics since 2014. Getting civilians out of captivity is extremely difficult. Ukraine has been forced to trade captured Russian soldiers to free civilians, something that goes against international humanitarian law. Civilians shouldn't be held captive at all. Take Linnea Umerova, a Crimean Tatar who finally came home this September after nearly 2 years in Russian prison. She was arrested on espionage charges in December 2022 while traveling to visit her seriously ill father in Simferopol, Crimea. Ukrainian journalist Viktoria Roshina, detained by Russian forces in occupied Berdyansk, died while being transported from a detention center in Taganrog, where she spent her final 6 months. Human rights defenders say this facility is notorious for torture. Former Ukrainian prisoners describe being beaten with rubber batons and wooden hammers and shocked with tasers. Russian prisoners have also reported torture at this facility. Since the invasion began, there have been 58 prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. The most recent one happened on October 19th, when 95 people returned to Ukraine, the coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war reported. This exchange was particularly significant because it included many Ukrainians who had been sentenced in Russian courts. 28 had received extremely long sentences, and 20 were facing life in prison. The New York Times reports that Russia still holds about 8,000 Ukrainian service members. According to Ukraine's coordination headquarters, 3,767 people have made it home so far, mostly military personnel. "77,143 Russian soldiers. That's how many we've confirmed dead in Ukraine, and we know each of their names. We maintain this list together with BBC's Russian service and a team of volunteers, confirming each death through multiple sources. For months now, the largest losses category were volunteers. Spare people, in the words of State Duma deputy and former DPR leader Alexander Baradai. Old men and weaklings who aren't expected to achieve even the smallest victory. These recruits are armed with outdated, limited equipment, with their primary task being to exhaust the enemy to the max.
Ты же знаешь, так сказать, что у нас там слабосилки, старики и все прочее огромное количество наблюдается. Ну, это масса как-то, но на вот этой всей, так сказать, истории она сопротивляется, когда нужно.
Beyond our names count, Mediazona also calculates the estimate of the total Russian deaths at the war. Our largest figure as of July 2024 stands at over 120,000. This estimate is based on complex analysis of the excess mortality data from Russia's probate registry. The war has led to mass desertion. Russian courts have handled 12,867 cases of soldiers going AWOL since mobilization began. That's as of November 12, 2024. Putin announced what he called partial mobilization in September 2022.
Указ о частичной мобилизации подписан. Мобилизационные мероприятия начнутся сегодня.
After that, the military banned personnel from leaving service, and parliament toughened penalties for military offenses. Thousands of Russian soldiers have refused to fight. Early in the war, they could relatively easily leave the front and return home. But commanders soon cracked down on refusers, threatening them, throwing them into makeshift prisons, the so-called pits, in occupied territories, or forcing them back to the front. Once these new military laws took effect, soldiers could no longer refuse to fight without facing charges. The number of cases spiked. The most common crime is AWOL. Nearly 13,000 such cases have reached the courts. Several hundred more face charges of desertion or disobeying orders. But getting charged doesn't mean escaping the war. On the contrary, courts typically hand down suspended sentences, which lets commanders send these soldiers right back to the front. "355 people are prosecuted for spreading fake news about the Russian army, according to human rights group Info. Just days after the invasion, the Kremlin introduced new laws targeting anti-war Russians. with penalties up to 15 years in prison for contradicting the Defense Ministry's position, now called public dissemination of knowingly false information or fake news about the military. That includes reporting on or just publicly discussing Bucha and other atrocities. Russians face prosecution for simply sharing posts and videos about attacks on Ukrainian cities or civilian deaths. No one is safe from these charges. Ordinary citizens, politicians, activists, journalists, even former police officers and war veterans. The first prison sentence for fake news about the army went to Alexei Gorinov, a 63-year-old Moscow district deputy. In July 2022, he got 7 years in prison for speaking out against the war at a council meeting. In court, he said, Russia exhausted its limit for wars in the 20th century. Yet there we are, Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel. These names don't mean anything to you, the prosecution. Take an interest and don't say later that you didn't know anything. For 5 months, Russia has been conducting military actions, shamefully calling them a special operation. Alexei Gorinov's health has severely deteriorated in prison, according to his supporters. Just last week, we saw another shocking case. Nadezhda Buyanova, a 68-year-old doctor from Moscow, received 5.5 years in prison. Her crime? The ex-wife of a soldier killed in Ukraine claimed the doctor told her son his father was a legitimate target for Ukraine during an appointment. Buyanova was found guilty despite no evidence and the accusers constantly changing testimony. Beyond fake news, Russia created 2 new laws against discrediting the armed forces. First offense brings administrative charges, but repeated within a year and you face criminal prosecution. Even saying no to war can get you arrested. Authorities use other charges too, justifying terrorism for commenting on attacks against pro-war figures, rehabilitating Nazism for comparing Russia to Nazi Germany, and sometimes even treason. According to Info, over 1,000 people have faced prosecution for opposing the war. For 105 days now, Ukraine held part of Russia's Kursk region. It began on the night of August 6th, when Ukrainian forces advanced into Russian territory. The defense, border guards, FSB units, and small military forces, including conscripts, was overwhelmed by the attack.
Сохраняйте спокойствие. Берегите себя и своих близких. Скоро вы будете демилитаризованы. БНР будет свободной.
Dozens of settlements fell under Ukrainian control, including the town of Sudzha. The Kremlin stayed silent about the advance for days. Putin dismissed it as yet another massive provocation, and the Defense Ministry waited until August 9th to admit there was fighting on the western outskirts of Sudzha. Meanwhile, residents had to flee the combat zone on their own, with some dying under shelling. These Kursk refugees struggled to find housing, and by early November, they were recording desperate video appeals to Putin for help.
Как получилось так, что на территории Курской области, в своем родном месте, где мы всегда детей учили патриотизму и учим вообще-то, как получилось так, что мы оказались за бортом?
When Sudzha residents held a protest in central Kursk, authorities labeled it an illegal protest. Speaking about these events, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky emphasized his country does not want Russian territory. The Kursk operation, he said, is a part of a larger military and diplomatic strategy. Everything we're doing aims to push Russia towards a fair peace. The International Criminal Court in The Hague has issued arrest warrants for 6 Russian officials. Vladimir Putin and Children's Rights Commissioner Lvova Belova are charged with deporting Ukrainian children. Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of Staff Gerasimov face charges for targeting civilians and energy infrastructure. 2 more warrants name military commanders: Long-Range Aviation Chief Sergei Kobylash and Black Sea Fleet commander Viktor Sokolov. The court says they're responsible for causing excessive incidental harm to civilians or damage to civilian objects and the crime against humanity of inhumane acts. Here at Mediazona, we will continue our independent count of Russian losses and documenting the Russian army's crimes in Ukraine. Thank you for watching.